I want to make a bold claim. There is no interesting history of the philosophy of pictures. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there is no interesting history to pictures themselves. Obviously there is. If you've ever seen these photographs of old cave paintings in the south of France, you will have seen pictures that are among the oldest that human beings ever did. They are very different from the kinds of images that you see today, even though they clearly work in the same way. And since then, leading up to now, a lot has happened. So we've invented new techniques, new pigments, oil paint, photography, the moving image, computer-generated images. All of that is the history of pictures, and it's a very interesting history that can be studied and traced. Now, what I want to claim is that there is no interesting history to the philosophy of pictures. So the philosophy of pictures is broadly concerned with the question, what is distinctive of the kind of representation you find in pictures and images? If you look at the history of philosophy, you will not really encounter that question until you reach the 20th century. It's only the 20th century that people start asking this question and become interested in it. As an observation about the history of philosophy, that's quite interesting, and you might wonder what actually underpins this. You can contrast it with a whole bunch of other questions that we still ask today. So the question, how ought we live? Or what is a good action? What is the right thing for us to do? Is a question that you find in ancient Greece, in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, and today. People have continuously been asking that question. Knowledge. What can we know, or what is knowledge? It's almost a philosophical universal. Every time period or every culture that has a kind of philosophical tradition will have asked that question about the nature and status of knowledge. Again, these are rough claims, maybe there are some exceptions, but by and large you find these philosophical universals. And my suggestion is that the question, what is pictorial representation, is just not one of them. Does that matter? Not really, because it is an interesting question. But it means that if you're interested in the philosophy of pictures, you should really look at a fairly recent period, starting broadly in the middle of the 20th century, leading up to today. This doesn't mean that philosophers haven't said interesting things about pictures, things that are philosophically interesting. I want to mention just a couple. In Plato's Republic, you find a very famous discussion of the painter. So in Socrates' words, you hear that the painter is someone who does something that is not much different from holding up a mirror. So when you hold up a mirror, Socrates says, you present or copy the appearances of things, the appearances of the things that are in front of the mirror. Is that difficult to do? No. It is a purely sort of reflecting process. It doesn't require any kind of understanding of the nature of the things that are reflected. And that's Socrates' point. The painter is concerned merely with the appearance, with copying the appearance of things, and you can do that without any specific understanding of the things in question, Socrates says. Is this a point about images or pictures? In a sense it is, because it embodies a certain understanding of what pictures, or at least a certain pictorial tradition, was all about, namely copying appearances. But Socrates' point isn't really a contribution to the philosophy of pictures. He's really making a point about the epistemic status of the appearance of things. So if you're just concerned with appearances, you do not really require any understanding of the nature of the things in question. It's that appearance-reality distinction that Socrates is interested in, and he's using the device of the picture and the painter to say something about it. Other example, Aristotle. In the Poetics, Aristotle talks about pictures of corpses. It's a bit gross, but his point is that people are fascinated by looking at pictures of corpses. They actually derive a kind of pleasure from those pictures, even where, in the actual fact, looking at the corpse would be just revolting and disgusting. So he seems to be interested in the way representation sparks a certain kind of pleasure or delight in us. According to Aristotle, it's the delight of recognition. It's the delight of recognizing a certain category or kind of thing when presented with a representation of it. Again, it's an interesting observation about pictures. We may learn from it. It may tell us something about the nature of pictures. But Aristotle doesn't make the point because he is interested in the nature of pictures. He makes the point because he is interested in a certain kind of cognitive pleasure, the pleasure we derive from exercising our recognitional capacities. Example number 3, intermissionist theories of vision. You find a specific model of how visual perception works throughout the history of philosophy. You find it in the pre-Socratics, in the medievals, and you find it in modern philosophy. The idea is very simple, and I bet that you believe that something like this is true. Something out in the world enters the eye and thereby affects the mind or the soul, and that is what visual experience consists in. Question: what is it exactly that enters the eye? This is really where the different theories come apart. There's an important tradition, already going back to Democritus and the pre-Socratics, that it is images, small images of things that enter the eye. So the pre-Socratics were thinking of items in the world, say an apple on your table, as emitting thin films of some kind of ethereal substance entering the eye. The point was that these films could be conceived of as images, as pictorial representations of the objects in question. Did they ask how these images represented? No. It was clear that they did, according to them. They used the idea of an image to explain how it is that we have some kind of cognitive access to the objects in the world. Immediately, we're just presented with the images. That is what the soul is presented with. But because these images are representations, visual representations of the objects in question, we have some kind of cognitive access to the world. That's the intermissionist theory of vision. It relies on the claim about images, but it doesn't constitute a philosophy of the image. The fourth moment happens in the Renaissance. When Alberti writes Della Pittura, he is interested in offering something like a manual for how painters go about making their paintings. But he makes a claim. It's an analogy. He likens the painting to a window. He's basically saying the picture is a window. Because, he thinks, when we look through a window, what we get to see is an array of light that is channeled through this opening in the wall and reaches our eyes. What the artist needs to do is pretend that the picture plane they are working on is a window on a scene, and they need to mark the individual point at which light rays that come from the object reach that plane with a bit of paint. And if they do that, and if they do that accurately, then the image that they produce is very much like, it's basically an exact copy of the optical image that would be produced if we treated all of this as something like an optical projection. That is really the method Alberti is proposing to the artists of his day. Pictures are like windows. Isn't this a philosophy of pictures? I don't think so. It's a metaphor. He doesn't mean this literally. It isn't true that pictures are transparent in the way windows are. It's just, according to Alberti, that painters can produce pictures if they liken it, the picture, to something like a projection screen. But that's more a technical observation. It's sort of an art theory that he's presenting. Maybe it's a normative ideal of how painters ought to paint, but there is really no presumption of something like a deep philosophical insight of how all images in fact work. In fact, Alberti was very well aware that many painters, Giotto as one of the examples, didn't work that way. So before the development of perspective, painters worked in a very different way. And although optics, of course, had one place in the way they produced their pictures, they clearly didn't know the theory of perspective in the way that Alberti proposed it. So even there, you see, although there are sort of philosophically interesting suggestions in Alberti's work, he is by no means offering an answer to the question, what is distinctive of pictorial representation? So these examples are meant to illustrate the claim that, on the one hand, philosophers and thinkers have said philosophically interesting things about pictures, but that, on the other, there really isn't anything that amounts to a philosophy of pictures in the sense I've outlined it. So, a philosophical treatment of the question, what is distinctive of the way pictures represent? For that, we really need to turn to what happens in the 20th century leading up to today.